Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving headfirst into one of the biggest, most timeless questions out there. It's a debate that has sparked countless arguments, pitting science against faith and reason against revelation. So, let's just put it out there. Does God exist? On the surface, it seems like a pretty straightforward yes or no question. But as you can imagine, getting to an answer is, well, it's anything but simple. Because here's the thing, the core of this whole debate isn't just about what answer you land on. It's about the path you take to get there. It's about the framework you use to even ask the question in the first place. Are we talking about pure logic, hard physical evidence, or is it something else entirely? So let's follow a few of these paths and just see where they lead. All right, let's start with the path of pure reason. For literally centuries, brilliant philosophers have tried to, or disprove, God's existence using nothing but logic. And one of the most famous thinkers to ever walk this path was the 13th century theologian, St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, to really get what Aquinas was doing, you have to understand this fundamental split in how philosophers even approach this stuff. On one hand, you have a priori arguments. Think of this as before experience. It's all conceptual. St. Anselm is a great example. He basically argued that just from the definition of God as the greatest being you can possibly imagine, he has to exist. But Aquinas, he went a completely different way. He was all about a posteriori arguments, reasoning after experience. He said, forget starting with a definition in our heads. Let's start with what we can actually see, touch, and observe in the world right in front of us. And that brings us to what's called his argument from motion. It's a perfect example of his approach. He starts with a super simple observation. Things are moving. You see it everywhere. But he says nothing can move itself. A paintbrush has the potential to paint a wall, but it needs a painter, an outside mover, to make that happen. And that painter had to be moved by something else, and so on and so on. Now here's the kicker. Aquinas argued that this chain of movers can't just go back forever. Why not? Well, think about it like dominoes. If there's no first domino to fall, then the second one can't fall, and then nothing happens at all. So for Aquinas, the conclusion was inescapable. There must be a first mover that started the whole chain reaction, something that isn't moved by anything else. And this, he said, is what everyone calls God. Okay, but what if pure reason isn't enough for you? What if you want tangible, physical evidence, the kind you can measure in a lab? Well, that brings us to our second path. This is the approach championed by creation science, which actively looks for scientific data to support a biblical account of our origins. Now, to understand this path, you first have to see how it frames its opponent. According to proponents like Major Coleman, the standard theory of evolution is built on a few key pillars, or postulates. First, that life somehow came from non-living matter. Second, that all the complex life we see today came from a single-celled ancestor. Third, that the engines driving all this change were just time and random chance. And fourth, that tiny changes within a species can eventually add up to create entirely new species. So, in direct contrast to that, creation science puts its own postulates on the table. It argues, number one, that if you see a complex design, like the code in DNA, it implies there has to be a designer. It also holds that life was created in distinct kinds, like the dog kind or the cat kind, and there are limits to how much they can change. It also points to a global flood as a major geological event that reshaped the planet. And finally, it argues that the Earth is young, thousands of years old, not billions. To argue against that time and chance idea from evolution, creation science often brings up probability. And the numbers they use are, well, they're mind-boggling. They'll point to the calculated probability of even one single simple protein assembling itself by pure chance. And that number is 1 in 10 to the 116th power. That is a 1 followed by 116 zeros. To put that in perspective, scientists estimate there are only about 10 to the 70th atoms in the entire known universe. So from their perspective, this isn't just unlikely, it's a mathematical impossibility. And this path of evidence brings up other specific data points, too. For example, they argue that carbon-14, which decays relatively quickly, is found in things like ancient coal and diamonds. If those things were millions of years old, there shouldn't be any carbon-14 left. They also point out that the oldest living trees on Earth are only about 4,000 years old, which they say fits nicely with a timeline after a global flood. And finally, they contend that the fossil evidence for human evolution is a lot weaker than most people think. So, okay, we've got these two very different paths, the path of reason and the path of evidence, and they seem to lead to completely different conclusions. But what if the real problem here isn't the logic or the evidence itself? What if the whole conflict is really just a war of definitions? What if both sides are arguing against two totally different ideas of what God even is? A lot of times, when you hear critics of religion, folks like Stephen Hawking or Leandro Carnal, they're often arguing against this idea of the God of the gaps. This is the view that God is basically just a placeholder for all this stuff science hasn't figured out yet. Like, what causes lightning? I don't know. God did it. And in this view, every time science makes a new discovery, like explaining how lightning actually works, the space for God gets smaller and smaller. But, and this is a really big but, that God of the gaps is a completely different being from the God of classical philosophy, the God that Aquinas was talking about. You see, for Aquinas, God isn't a gap in the chain of scientific causes. He is the first cause that holds the entire chain of reality in existence. So from this point of view, a new scientific discovery doesn't threaten God at all. It just reveals the amazing, intricate way that his creation works. This analogy of a jet engine absolutely nails the difference. Think about it. You can have a brilliant scientist give you a complete scientific explanation for how a jet engine works, right down to the laws of thermodynamics and physics. But does that scientific explanation somehow disprove the existence of its inventor, Sir Frank Whittle? Of course not. The two explanations aren't competing. They're operating on different levels. One tells you how it works, and the other tells you why it exists in the first place. And this isn't some newfangled idea. Just look at Isaac Newton. When he discovered the law of universal gravitation, he didn't stand up and say, "Great, now we don't need God anymore." Not at all. For him, it was the opposite. He believed he had uncovered the brilliant mechanism, the elegant law that God uses to run the universe. Understanding the law didn't get rid of the lawgiver, it just revealed the lawgiver's genius. So, where does all this leave us? We've gone down the path of pure reason, we've explored the path of physical evidence, and we've uncovered this deep fundamental conflict over the very definition of God. Which kind of brings us back to the main question: what is this debate really about? You know, maybe the real conflict here isn't science versus faith at all. Maybe it's a conflict that's happening on a much deeper level, a clash between two totally different sets of unseen assumptions. One philosophy sees God as a shrinking gap in our knowledge, while the other sees God as the very foundation of all reality. And those hidden starting points, they change everything. They determine what you even consider to be proof. And that leaves all of us with a final, really challenging question to think about. At the end of the day, reason and evidence are our primary tools for understanding the world. But what are we supposed to do when those very tools, depending on the assumptions we start with, can be used to build entirely different, competing realities? What does that tell us about the search for truth itself? Thanks for joining us.